All right, and good morning, Ridgepoint Church. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. Man, listen, I was up in the baptistry. I told Amanda earlier, like the noise when she got out of the water, like we've been trying to talk about the idea that when there's baptism taking place, it's a celebration. It's this kind of culture we're trying to develop. And when she came up out of the water, I said, man, that was the most raucous I've ever heard the congregation on a Sunday morning, especially for 9 a.m., which means either we're getting it or we just really like Amanda. I'm not sure which one it is, but probably a little bit of both. And I'm sure you love being the center of attention right now. So listen, man, we're here. We're excited. It's Baptism Sunday. There's a lot of cool things taking place. And I get the privilege of wrapping up this series, a series that I've kind of grown to love. I've always loved this book, even when I was in college. I remember kind of going through this with one of my professors in college and just kind of really loving what was taking place in the book and how it wasn't like a clear-cut, this is what you should do, and they're dealing with issues in culture. So I've always kind of had this affinity for this book, and then even this week as kind of studying and seeing what's going on in the world, I said, man, this might have been given to us for such a time as this to help us process through how do we as believers living in 2018, how do we do this, which is really, really challenging? How do we figure out how to figure out a way to make our faith and life intersect, even when it comes to the toughest issues of our day? See, it's relatively easy for us looking back at the topic that Paul's addressing in Philemon because for the most part, we've agreed that what he's addressing is something that's wrong, but in his day, it wasn't wrong. And so for him, as he does his teaching, he's very careful about the terminology he uses and the words he uses because they're still kind of figuring it out. And the biggest thing is the church at this point is a relatively new concept. The church at large had only been around for about 35 years. This particular church that Paul's writing to, that Philemon's a part of, has only been around for at most a couple of years. And so they said, we've wrapped our minds around this idea that Jesus is arisen, that he's our Savior, and that we base our life upon him. What we're trying to grapple with, what they're trying to grapple with then, and what we try to grapple with now is, how do I take that concept and that idea, and how do I have that interact with the big things of my life that I've not yet figured out? How do I take that and we start talking about some things that we're not sure how that's supposed to work out, and culture's kind of dictating going in some directions. How do I take my faith and figure out how that interacts with my life? And so Paul says, we're still grappling with this, we're still dealing with it, and I think that's a challenge for us today. So I think I'm excited as we wrap up this series to kind of bring it really practical. At the end of the book, at the end of this message, I'm going to give you something that maybe even if you've been reading through this, you haven't thought through. But for me, what is the most powerful part of this particular book? But with that being said, we're going to get started. We actually left off last week. I'm going to give us a little bit of a background. That way, if you've been here, it'll be a kind of a refresher as to where we're at. If you're brand new here this morning, thank you for joining us. We're glad you're our guest this morning, and I'm going to bring you up to speed as well. It's kind of what's taking place. So what happened in the early church, Jesus he was crucified, he's resurrected, and he's ascended into heaven, and once he's gone, the disciples start to go out and they start to talk about Jesus, and eventually a person who used to hate Christians but became a believer was the Apostle Paul. And he starts to go out and he starts to plant churches. He says, I believe this message is so powerful, it's so telling, that I want to make sure the whole world knows about this. And so he travels from city to city, planting churches and saying, I want to camp here for a little bit, or I want to camp here for a couple of years. I want to help build up a church, put leadership in charge of it, and then I'm going to go to the next city and do the very same thing. And that's kind of what he did on these missionary journeys that he took, was he helped the church to grow and to flourish, and then when he'd leave, he'd write back and he'd write a letter and say, hey, I heard this is going on that I have to address. And that's kind of how he did his ministry. Well, at some point in one of those missionary journeys, he ends up in a town called Ephesus, which is a port town. It's about 100 miles from the town where Philemon lives, a town called Colossae. So he ends up in Ephesus for 3 years. While he's there, at some point in that process, the Bible doesn't say how it happened, but at some point in that process, Philemon has either traveled down or Paul took a short trip to Colossae. We don't know that he ever actually went there, but Philemon becomes a believer in Jesus. And he goes back to his city and he says, we need to have a church here. He's wealthy, he's a landowner, he has a large house. He says, why doesn't the church meet in my house? And we know that he loves God and he loves the church and he's trying to do his very best. But there's also the controversy of his day because Philemon, being a wealthy landowner, also was a slave owner. He owned at least one, probably multiple slaves, one of which is the third main character in the story, Onesimus. So what has happened is Onesimus has It seems like from what we read, he's being treated really, really well, but he says, I want my freedom, and so he escapes. What we're going to read today seems to indicate that when he escapes, he probably robbed from his owner, he robbed from Philemon in order to finance his escape. And he escapes some 1,200 miles away to the city of Rome in Italy. And when he gets there, either by design or by accident, he runs into Paul, who's teaching about Jesus, and Onesimus himself becomes a believer. And he becomes really, really close to Paul. Their relationship is such that Paul's spending a lot of time with him, and Paul says, this guy who used to be unprofitable is now really, really profitable. He's really growing. He's understanding who Jesus is. He's wanting to do things right. And Paul says, I would love to keep him here. But part of the process of our growth with Jesus is we ask the tough questions. We mentioned this last week. The tough question is not, what do I feel like doing? The tough question is not, what can I get away with? The tough question is, what ought I do? What's the thing? What's the right thing for me to do? In other words, what we're going to get to today is, what does my faith dictate that I do? So when it comes to the tough issues, you and I have this natural tendency, even if we've been following Jesus for some time, we have this natural tendency when it comes to tough issues to fall back into our natural tendencies. What are the things we kind of brought up bringing, which maybe we had a biblical upbringing, and that's a good thing, but we fall back to this is where I'm comfortable. This is kind of what society has deemed acceptable. This is what I feel like is the right thing. And we have a tendency to gravitate towards the easier decision. When I come and face a big decision or even something that doesn't seem that big but seems clear-cut, I say I don't have to spend a lot of time praying about this or reading scripture about this because it seems like the decision is fairly simple. But Paul says it's not that easy. And when he's speaking directly to Onesimus, now what we read in his writing to Philemon is what he actually writes to him. The other we can only draw from inference of what takes place. But at some point in that conversation, it seems like he comes to Paul and says, hey, here's what happened. I ran away. Seems like he stole some money. I want to stay here. I love what we're doing. But what should I do? And Paul says, well, what ought you do? What's the right thing? What does your faith dictate? And we look at that and say, but wait a minute. Wait a minute. This guy was a slave owner. Like, he was wrong. Onesimus might have been like 5% wrong, but this guy was a slave owner. He was 95% wrong. Doesn't that kind of balance? Couldn't he just get away with it? And most of us would probably answer the question, well, yeah, because that's the easy thing. But Paul gets to the heart of the issue. Paul says, I'm discipling this guy. I believe a whole lot in this guy, and I believe he's really, really profitable. But I want to teach him not to take the easy road. I want to teach him to make the tough decisions. And in doing so, I believe it's going to be a witness to the church, to the world, and to culture, and ultimately to the world, that this is how, when there's friction, when life doesn't seem all that easy, this is how we allow for our faith to interact with our life. Like, those two things are essentially important. We're living our lives, and we live a natural life, and yet there's a spiritual context to it, and we have to figure out, when it comes to life, how does my faith interact with my life? And so Paul says, Onesimus, here's what you have to do. You have to go make that right. You have to return in 1,200 miles by land and by sea back to your city, your hometown of Colossae. You need to go talk to that slave owner. And by the way, simply by him doing it, he realized there's going to be some friction there. When slaves would escape and they'd be returned, or when they would return, which they never returned on their own, this is going to be a very unique situation. But when they were returned, there was always a rub there. They'd lose their position in the household. Sometimes they would even lose their life. And so Paul says, I know what you're risking by doing this, but here's what your faith dictates. If you've done something wrong, go and make it right. So he says to Onesimus, it's not that I necessarily like it. I'd prefer for you to stay here with me. But you got to go back. And he sends him back. But when he sends him back, he says, but I'm not going to send you alone. I'm going to send you back, and I'm giving you all these things. And one of the things we mentioned last week, he gives him kind of, it's not really a new name, but it's a restoration of his name. He says, you used to be useless. Now you're useful both for Philemon and for myself. And they also sends him with this letter, the letter that's addressed to Philemon. And in it, we've said the last couple of weeks that it's really this plea by Paul on Onesimus' account. And it's not clear-cut, especially what we read last week. It's not clear-cut what the plea is. But he sends him with a new name. He sends him with a new plea for Onesimus to be restored. And all that's clear is he's asking for there to be reconciliation, and he asks for there to be restoration. He says, this is important. I don't want you to view him now as you did before, just as a slave, but he's being returned to you now as a brother. So the one thing we've seen fairly clear, and it'll become more clear today, is that he's asking for there to be restoration that happens. And Paul says, this is really, really important to me because I had a chance to lead Philemon to Christ, and he's important to me. But I've had a chance to lead Onesimus to Christ and spend a lot of time with that person. And so because of that, there's a camaraderie there. And I want to make sure that both of you get this right. And so the letter that we have is the conversation that Paul has with Philemon. We don't have the benefit of actually seeing what he says to Onesimus. It's all by inference, like I said before. But this letter is clearly, this is what he's saying. He says, I'm in prison in Rome. I can't leave. And then he's going to say, I wish I could be there and prepare a place for me. But I can't leave right now. So all that I can say on this subject is this letter, this postcard I'm sending to you. And my admonishment to you, this is what you should do. This is what we know what Onesimus ought to do. But Philemon, what ought to be your response? So we're going to pick up today with the last verse we talked about last week. Verse 14 is kind of where we left it. It says in verse 14 of Philemon, there's only one chapter, so that we just outline it by verses. In verse 14 it says this, but I preferred to do nothing without your consent, in order that your goodness might not be by compulsion, but of your own accord. Paul had said, I could, because of my apostolic authority, because I have authority as an apostle, I could have come in and demanded that you do this. But he said, the heart is really important to me, so I don't want you to do something because you have to do it. We have to move as we mature. We have to move from doing something out of authority to doing something out of influence. He says, Paul writes and says, I could do this out of authority. I could demand this. But instead, I'd prefer for there to be influence. I'd prefer for you to do this not because you're compelled or because you have to, but because that is your heart. He says, I want there to be reconciliation. I want there to be restoration. But I don't want you to do the right thing for the wrong reason. I want you to make sure you do the right thing, but do it for the right reason. And this is really important, and Paul's going to go a step further. Because for most of us, if we even get this far, and we say we're longing for restoration and reconciliation, we care about these two people, we think that's going to be enough. But Paul says, this is so important to me that what we're about to read is Paul saying, I want as best I can. Because Paul's a human, he's just like you and I. There's nothing special in particular about him. He could make mistakes. But he says, I want to make sure I get this right. I want to make sure this is so important to me. I want to make sure I give you good advice, good counsel, but I also want to make sure that if I can help reconciliation take place, that I'm going to be the person that helps restore that reconciliation. And in doing so, Paul says, one person described it as this: there is no better picture of what Jesus did for humanity than what Paul did and offered for Onesimus. Now that's a huge statement. I'm going to read that to us again. Because in the writer that wrote this, he says, I've read through this. And when we see what Paul does and what we're about to read, he says, there is no better picture of what Jesus did for humanity than what Paul did and he offered for Onesimus. You see, Paul had written this earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. One of a couple places he says something like this. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, it says this: be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Paul says, listen, I don't always get it right. I try and I make mistakes. I think sometimes, I had a conversation with one of my friends recently, and he said, man, sometimes it seems like pastors, they have it all together, and they must pray like 20 hours a day, and like they need like other 4 hours to sleep and eat and all those other important things. But listen, let me clue you in. Pastors don't always get it right. Pastors' families don't always get it right. They're not perfect. And so Paul says, I don't always get it right. I stumble and I fall and I get back up and I try again. But in those moments when I get it right, in those moments when to the best of my ability, I am imitating Christ, he says, follow that example. And there might be no better illustration of any human being ever, but definitely in the life of the Apostle Paul, there might be no better illustration than the scripture we're about to read as he gets into, here's what I'm willing to do to help there be reconciliation. And as he does it, there's three things that he does, three things that he provides to help bring about reconciliation. The first one, Paul acts as an agent to bring about reconciliation. Watch as the very next verse in Philemon, verse 15 says this, for perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. He says, listen, I believe it's possible, even though culture has dictated, if a slave returns to the home, if a slave is restored and returned to the home, restoration isn't always possible. In fact, it rarely ever happens. But Paul says, both of you are really, really important to me. And I believe that grace allows for reconciliation to take place. And so as much as it is possible for me to be a part of the reconciliation process, I want to be able to do that. Now, most of us, if we have family members that aren't getting along, or maybe we're friends with a husband and wife and they're not getting along, and we look at the situation and we say, man, I don't even know where to begin. There's so much drama, there's so much baggage. I don't even want to enter into the fray. And Paul says, not only am I going to give solid advice, but I'm going to put my money literally where my mouth is. I believe reconciliation is possible. I care about both of these people, and both these people are good people, but a situation has arisen between them where it seems like reconciliation isn't possible. And Paul steps in and says, I believe not only is reconciliation possible, but it's necessary. And grace has the ability to reconcile what seems to be irreconcilable. I want us to get that. Grace has the ability to reconcile what seems to be irreconcilable. And so Paul looks at the situation. He says, it's not enough for me to sit back. I could keep Onesimus, and the world would never know, and everything would be okay, and I'd love the situation. But grace allows for there to be reconciliation where it seems like things are irreconcilable. And so I'm going to write a letter, and I'm going to challenge both of these people who we know love Jesus and love the church. I'm going to invite both of them to have a conversation where reconciliation is possible. And so he says, I want to come in not just as an outsider and say, you guys go figure it out. It would have been simple enough if it's you and me and we want to take the next step. We'd say, Onesimus, I want you to be here, but you go figure it out first. Go get reconciled and come back. Like that would have been a step that most of us wouldn't even have taken. We would have kept Onesimus with us. If we said, go and do this, go reconcile, that would have been a huge step. But Paul says, no, I want to help become an agent for reconciliation. And in doing so, Paul takes on, like the commentator mentioned, he takes on a picture of who Jesus was for us. See, because of the mistakes that you and I made, we had the separation from the Father, and Jesus comes in and says, I want to be an agent to bring about reconciliation, because outside of Jesus, there was never going to be reconciliation. And he says, I'm going to be the agent of reconciliation. I'm going to be the agent of restoration. And so when the commentator says that Paul has this beautiful image of Jesus, he's saying because he steps in to our fray. He steps into the mess of our life and says, I'm going to love you where you're at. And I'm going to serve as an agent of reconciliation. But that wasn't enough. That was the beginning steps of what Paul was going to do. Believing grace is the ability to reconcile what seems irreconcilable. Paul gives advice, but literally when I said when Paul wants to put his money where his mouth is, the second thing Paul does is Paul is willing to pay the price himself for restoration. Paul is willing to say, I know what I've said, But words can sometimes be vain if there's not actions matched to them. So I want to not just be an agent of reconciliation, but I want to pay the price for restoration to be possible. I want to pay the price to make sure that the restoration, I care about these two people, that the restoration itself here takes place. And so we pick up in verse 17, and it says this, so if you consider me your partner. Now, by the way that is worded, he's saying it this way. If you consider me your partner, and I assume that you do. But then he says this, receive him as you would receive me. If he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account. And then he says this, I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay it. And then he adds this, we'll mention this a little bit later, but then he adds this, to say nothing of your owing me your own self besides. But he says this way before that, he says, listen, if he's wronged you in any way, because you consider me a partner, because we've worked together, we helped launch that church, and there's history, and we've partnered together literally in wanting to tell the world and telling our own area about who Jesus is. So he says, we're tight, we've worked together. I had a chance yesterday, I traveled over to St. Pete, kind of where I grew up, and I had a chance to be a youth pastor there for a while. And unfortunately, tragically, there was a young man who died very, very young, 24 years old, of cancer. And it's one of those really, really tough things. You never want to see that. It seems like he died so young. And yet you go there, and it's this weird kind of situation where you hate the situation, but you're seeing people you haven't seen in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And there's that camaraderie of saying, man, I remember what it was like when we served together and we worked together. There's a camaraderie that years and miles can't separate that. And Paul writes and says, by the way, if you consider me a partner, and I assume that you do, like we're on the same page, we're on the same team, we've worked together. So if you've considered me a partner, and I assume that you do, here's what I want you to do. Receive him as you would receive me. When Onesimus comes, you have the absolute right to do whatever you want. But here's what your faith dictates. Receive him as you would me. See, a little bit earlier what we read, it said maybe God was bringing all that apart, all that to account for a season in order for something better to be restored. He says, now that he's come and now that restoration is possible, I want you to receive him as you would receive me. And this is so important to me. Reconciliation is so important to me that I'm willing to pay the price of whatever he's done that has brought damage to you. So he says in the next verse, if he's wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account. Paul says, right now, we're straight, we're even. I don't owe you anything. There's no finances that I owe you. But this is where it seems to indicate that when Onesimus left, he probably left and stole something from his owner to finance the trip. And so Paul says, I know that as he's returning, and for there to be restoration in the world's eyes, the only way for there to be actual restoration, if the slave had been caught by the authorities and had been brought back and be returned, he would have to pay back what he took and often have to pay above what he took. And so Paul says, I know that he's returning, he's used that money up on the trip, so whatever he owes you, my plan is eventually to come in to visit you. And so whatever he owes you, put that on my account. And when I make that trip to you, whatever he's taken from you, I will restore that. I will pay the price literally for restoration. And we look at that, and most of us living in our American culture say, I'm willing to give up some time. If I have families that are going through difficult times, I'm willing to give up some time and offer counsel, and I'll even mediate between the two and try to talk it out. But if one person is taking money from the other person, I'm not going to put my money up and say, here, he owes you $500, here it is, I'll pay it for him. But Paul says, this is so important to me. He doesn't say, I know where the money's coming from, but he says, when I come, if he owes you anything at all, put that on my account. Charge that to me, and when I come, I'll pay it. He says, not only do I want to be an agent to help bring about reconciliation, but I want to be willing to pay the price for restoration. So we go back and look at the commentator's comment about how Philemon, this letter to Philemon, is a beautiful picture of how Paul represents who Jesus is. Because that's exactly what Jesus did for us. He said there's a price that we cannot pay. There's a price because of sin. There's a price that you and I cannot at all pay. So Jesus says, because you can't pay the price, I'll pay the price for you. I'll step in because grace is allowing there to be reconciliation where it seems to be irreconcilable. I'll step in and I'll pay the price. Andy Stanley said this about grace. He said, grace is inviting to the unrighteous and threatening to the self-righteous. He says, here's the picture of grace. Grace says, I'll pay that I'll put that on my account, I'll pay it for you. Why? Because for the person who says, I know there's no way I could earn what is not rightfully mine, I can't earn that, I can't do it myself, I can't pay the price. Grace steps in and says, I'm going to reconcile what seems to be irreconcilable. So for the person who is unrighteous, grace is this beautiful invitation. But for the person who's self-righteous, who thinks I can do it all myself, I can pay my own price, grace is threatening. Because it answers that by saying, no, you can't. So Paul steps in and says, if he owes you anything, put it on my account. When I return, I'll pay it for him. But then he finishes out with this, and some people have had some questions about this part of Philemon. He says, if he owes anything, I'll put it on my account. And by the way, verse 19, he says, I, Paul, write this with my own hand, I will repay it. We often, I'll use terminology where Paul writes this. Paul actually often would dictate his letters. He wouldn't write it himself. He would have someone next to him who would be kind of a scribe for him, and he would say, hey, write this. And we think it's because of this. We think it's because Paul had a physical issue, that it might have been an eye issue, where it's really hard for him to be able to see, to be able to write. In fact, in Galatians chapter 6, verse 11, he's writing, and often what happened at the end of his letters, he'd write it in his own hand. And in Galatians chapter 6, verse 11, it says, see with what large letters I am writing you with my own hand. Paul dictates the letter, but at the very end he says, I want to make it personal, and so I write really big because it's hard. We think it's because it's hard for him to see. So when Paul wraps this thing up, he says, I'm putting my name to it, and just in case you're afraid that it's not actually me, that I'm not actually saying this, I'm going to write this out in my own hand so that you know that it's me. This is how important this is to me. I'm putting my name on the line. But then he wraps this section up by saying this, to say nothing of your owing me, even your own self. He says, I want us to understand this is a physical thing, but it's much more than a physical thing. It's a spiritual thing. And he says, by the way, whatever it takes physically, I'm going to make it up to you. But realize, and this is so important because sometimes we miss this. He says there's also a spiritual indebtedness. I look at in my life people who have poured into me through the years. I've looked at my pastors, I've looked at my professors, and I owe this debt of gratitude to them. Because it's because of them that I was led to Christ, or it was because of them that I was able to grow my faith in specific areas. And even today, there are people, mentors speaking into my life that I need, and I look at them and say, it's not that I physically owe you anything, but spiritually, there's an indebtedness to you because of what you've done. And so Paul says, whatever it is physically, I'll take care of it, but realize there's a spiritual indebtedness as well that is even more significant and even more powerful. So I don't want you to miss that. Because that is of the utmost importance, way more important than the physical thing. That being said, Paul says, but I'm willing to pay the price. Then we get to verse 20 to the end of the chapter. And I'm going to do this first. I'm going to read the rest of the chapter. We're going to read through this whole book. And then when we're done, I want to come back and comment about how, kind of where the chapter leaves us and how there's this blanket application. Because the third thing, Paul had said that he wants to act as agent of reconciliation. He wants to pay the price for restoration. But Paul believes the church will ultimately rise to the situation. Verse 20, it says this, yes, brother, I want some benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Christ. Confidence of your obedience, I write to you knowing that you will do even more than I say. At the same time, prepare a guest room for me, for I'm hoping that through your prayers, I will be graciously given to you. He's kind of wrapping this up saying, prepare a guest room for me. I'm hoping to be free. Pray for me to be free, and then I want to come and visit you. And then he sends his final greetings. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ, sends greetings to you. And so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit. And that's how he finishes out the letter. And so Paul writes, and the funny thing is that there's a little bit more clarity. There's a little bit more of an understanding because he says, I want to write to plead for my child Onesimus. But there's still not a lot of clarity. Okay, what exactly do you want him to do? We want you to put it on his account, but on the other side of this, what do you want? Like if I'm the reader of this, I'll say, okay, Paul, I read that, I get all of that. But what are you getting at? Like, what's the end game for this letter? And he doesn't really say. There's a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of information, but at the end he says, I know what I'm asking of you, but I also believe that you're going to do even more than I ask. See, he said there's this controversy of the day. There's starting to be this rising social conscience that slavery was wrong. And so because of that, he says, I'm commenting, and we're still as a society figuring that out. It's easy for us to look back 2,000 years and say they should have figured it out, but they hadn't. Roman culture hadn't. And so he says, we're still figuring out what this looks like. So I'm going to ask you to restore him, treat him like a brother, not like a slave. But at the other side, I don't know what that looks like, but I do know this. Whatever I'm asking, I expect the church to respond in an even greater way. See, he sends out words like this. Back in verse 17, these are all commands to Philemon. Receive him. Verse 18, charge that to my account. Verse 20, refresh my heart. Verse 21, do even more than. Verse 22, prepare that guest room for me. He says there's a bunch of things that I want to see you do. But at the end of the day, whatever I ask of you, I believe that you, and by proxy the church, is going to do even more than I ask. Why? Because through the history, the church, and I want us to understand this, the church, capital C, not little c. Because every one of us that's here could write a story. Most of us could write a book about individual instances in church where we've been wronged and it hurt. I never want to belittle that. Every one of us has stories. I have stories. I get that. And there's times that the lowercase c church is wrong. And there's times that capital C church, it takes a while for them to get the picture of what's supposed to be right. But once the church at large gets it, they gravitate towards, man, we want to make sure that we get this right. We want to make sure that we figure out societal ills and deal with those things in a relevant manner. And that's why, even though the church struggled with this topic, and the church, lowercase c, sometimes still struggles with this topic, large case c, the church throughout history has been the one saying we need to lead revolutionary change in our culture. It's why William Wilberforce had one of the most compelling statements, one of the most popular statements on what it means to fight against slavery. And in his world, he says this: you can choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you didn't know. When he championed, we have to free slaves, we have to stop this. He says you can choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you didn't know what was taking place. It's why today it's often Christians leading the charge against human trafficking, some of which we know came right out of our church, say, man, we want to lead the charge to make sure the world knows that this isn't okay. Because Paul says, I believe the church, when the church becomes aware of the issue, and the church has time to collect itself, it says we have to rise up. We have to figure this thing out and start to affect society around us. And so Paul writes and says, I expect the church to do even more than I've asked. And that was about the controversial issue of his day. It's easy for us to look back and have 2,000 years of context and say, okay, but that's not me. That's not our controversy. But what about when we have controversies today? And I'm not looking to get into a political discussion that's for life and for Facebook and all that. But I am asking us to do this. When it comes to those controversial topics, ask ourselves this question. Not what feels good to me. Not what can I get away with. But what does my faith dictate that I do? Because as a society and as believers, sometimes we're guilty of associating with ideas and philosophies and say, well, this is kind of where I feel good. This is my zone. These are my people. This is who I hang out with. And so because of that, I'm going to gravitate towards their way of thinking. Sometimes that can be good. Sometimes that can be dangerous. But we have a tendency to gravitate towards, this is where I'm comfortable. This is where I feel good. And then we have these major issues that we're facing, and we're put into different groups and put in different factions. And if the other person doesn't agree with me on this topic, which the Bible hasn't even commented on, they must be the enemy. And that's partly why I believe Paul doesn't directly address slavery in this letter. He addresses the human heart condition. Because he says if we get the heart right, the other issues start to get resolved. Ultimately, the greatest need that our world has right now is to have a fractured relationship with God be restored through Jesus. That's it. If we get that right, and we start to surrender to say, man, Jesus, whatever you have, what does my faith dictate? I want to go ahead and I want to live that out. That should be our guiding premise. Not what feels good to me. Not what is the argument that I've already had. Because there's controversies rising every week where people get on Facebook and they make their arguments, and it's the same arguments over and over again. We all want the same outcome. But the arguments are just repeated over and over again. And the funny thing is, I have friends on both sides of every one of these debates. And they create these memes, they put them out there, and I say, well, you're picking and choosing the data that fits your side. But you haven't addressed this data that doesn't fit your side, and we address it from our thinking of what makes us comfortable, or what makes us feel good, or what makes us kind of where we've always fit in. And we've not asked the question, what does our faith dictate of us? So Paul writes and says to Philemon, here's what I'm asking of you. Do these things. But verse 21, I'm confident that not only will you be obedient, but I know that you will do even more than I say. I'm confident that you're going to rise up, and through the history we've seen the church, the history of the world, we've seen the church eventually rise up and do that. The one question that we have as we close out this book, and the question that plagued me for the longest time is, okay, but what happened? Like I read this whole thing, and I remember as a college student reading it and saying, I want to know what happened. Like he returns, was he killed? Like what took place? Did the letter even make it to Philemon? And then just kind of reasoning it out. Did Onesimus return the letter to Philemon? Because if it's me in that situation, I think about it this way. I would think like, okay, I'm meeting with Paul. He's my mentor. He's discipling me. And I feel really good. I'm resolved. It's like we leave church on a Sunday morning and we're like, yeah, I get it. I want to go make a difference. And then we get away from that area where we were really comfortable and challenged and pushed. And we get out in the world and we're like, man, what seemed really good a couple of hours ago doesn't seem as good now. So I wonder when Onesimus got out there and he had the letter in his hand, he's like, I got this. Paul said I should go. And he gets on the boat. And he's traveling from Rome eventually to Ephesus, to Colossae. And he's traveling by boat. And he gets out on the boat and he's thinking, wait a minute, this is crazy. I'm about to give up my freedom. It'd be really easy to take that letter, toss it overboard. But the letter exists. Which means that at some point, Onesimus said, I can't just run from this. The letter wouldn't have been preserved if he says, I'm giving up, I'm not following this. At some point, he would have torched the letter or he'd thrown the letter overboard. It wouldn't have existed. In the same way, he brings the letter to Philemon. Philemon reads the letter. It would have been really easy to say, I know what Paul's asking, but that's way more than I could expect to do. I don't want there to be record of this because I don't want anyone to say, wait, Paul told you to do this, and you didn't. Today it'd be like deleting emails. I want to make sure there's no history of this. I want to make sure no one can follow the paperwork. But the letter exists. The letter exists, I believe, showing that these two men said, I want to set the example for the church of what reconciliation and restoration is supposed to be. And the letter exists that restoration and reconciliation is possible even when everything looks irreconcilable. So I believe the letter exists fully today. Now history tells us both of them did, when the relationship was restored, they both become leaders in the church. We don't have biblical evidence of that. But history shows us that. But I believe even beyond that, the Bible indicates that restoration and reconciliation happened. Why? because Paul stepped into the most desperate of situations. A situation that I would have shied away from, and he says, I want to make things right. I want to set an example of what Jesus would have done, because we believe today, as they believed 2,000 years ago, that Jesus makes our lives better, but he also makes us better at life. The first part of that we see over and over. We see that when there's a baptism, and Jesus makes my life better, and we want to celebrate that. But he also makes us better at life, because when we start to wrestle with those tough issues of the day, he says, I want your faith to be your guide. Not what feels good or what seems right to you right now, but I want your faith to be your guide. And if you lean on Jesus, he helps us figure out the mess and the messes of our life. Let's pray together. God, I thank you first and foremost for the grace that you have in our life. God, it's simply because of Jesus that he was one to come into our life and be the agent of reconciliation and to be the one who pays the price for there to be redemption. God, let us never forget that it's only because of him that there's restoration. But God, I also thank you for people in our lives that have acted as agents of reconciliation and paid the price for there to be restoration. God, I thank you for people who, when the going got tough, they stood up and said, my faith matters, my faith dictates how I proceed from this point on. God, I pray that for all of us this morning, that we're not comfortable asking the easy questions, but that you allow us, as we wrap up this series, to ask the tough questions of life. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.